Welcome to the summary video for the TED Talks Series 3, which is on the theme of decision making. And I'm joined today by Dr. Craig Marsh, who's Head of Business School at the Lincoln International Business School. Craig, thank you for joining us, and thank you also for your support during the TED Talks series.
You're very welcome, Anna. It's been a pleasure.
Great, thank you, and for conducting all the interviews on our behalf. So this is obviously an opportunity for us to discuss the themes and really sort of highlight the really important, issues that came out of these interviews. But the reason that we chose decision making is because it's not talked about as much as I think it should be, and it's a hugely important part of leadership. We can have all the soft skills, all the emotional intelligence in the world, but if we're making bad decisions, then that's going to show up in our performance, right? So really interesting topic.
Very much so, and in fact there were so many insights from the paper. It's been actually quite difficult to combine them into a summary. But what we've done is we've followed a sort of broad structure for both the paper and for this interview. So we're going to have a look at some of the global context, not really high level, some of the global context, some of the things that are going on in the world that make the context for strategic decisions. Have a look at some of the effects of that on strategic decisions. Then secondly, we're going to take a look at the organisational context and how senior leaders have created structures and processes and governance structures inside organisations to make their decision-making effective. And then we're going to look at the third part, which of course is the individual level and what goes on often actually inside your head when you're faced with critical decisions. And we'll finish off with just a couple of lessons for leaders.
Great, thank you. Lots of layers in there, isn't it? So let's start at the top then. So with the global context. And I know we obviously interviewed Blair Shepherd, who's recently released his very good book, 10 Minutes to Midnight. And he talks in there about 4 global crises. And I wondered if you could just expand a little bit on that and what came out of that.
Yeah, indeed. And obviously given his position at the head of PwC, he was very much looking at, as he's advising clients in very strategic, very long-term decisions, what is the context within which those decisions are being made? And he identified these global crises that we're all faced with. And indeed, the references are there, and we'll hear from Blair in a second. I think the two that were really striking for us was a crisis of what he called a crisis of prosperity and a crisis of technology. So these were 2 of the 4 that he'd identified. The other 2 were crisis against institutions and crisis of leadership. And the crisis of leadership is one that we'll come back to. So we'll just hear Blair now describing for himself in brief what those 4 crises are that he sees.
The first crisis is crisis of prosperity, which is, as I said, around the world, the vast majority of people feel like the future is worse than the current reality.
Right.
And when that happens, they stop trying. And that's largely a result of disparity between people, between regions, again, about London and Northern England, for example, and between generations. Right? The second one is crisis of technology. And there's 2 parts of this. The first one is the industrial system has as a byproduct CO2 equivalents, which within a decade, if we don't address them, the world goes very dark, right? Because of the feedback loops in the system. Yeah. And the other one is actually the way we're talking to each other. The technology system has a series of unintended consequences that are really quite dire. And as we go to AI, to become harder and harder to audit and do something about, which is why it's a decade. Then the third one is a crisis in institutions, which is that people have lost faith in institutions. The data on this one's kind of interesting. 18% of people around the world in Edelman survey, which is 75 countries they survey, believe the system's working for them. If I went back 2 decades, it would have been in the 70s. It's a massive drop in trust in institutions. And so those are the crises. Pretty serious, actually.
Really interesting, isn't it? Because, we don't operate in isolation. We're all operating within this global context, and it influences us, at all of the layers we're going to talk through as we go through it, isn't it? But from the organisational side, what was the so what that came out of this? What were the consequences?
Well, he was pretty clear on that. And I think the first one, which wouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but often I think it is worth us just identifying that point, which is to be really clear about the why, the purpose. Now, in his context and his advice is that actually wherever you are in the world, and particularly in senior level of organizations, you ought to be making your decisions with a very clear view about how it is and why it is that you're helping to move towards resolving one of these global crises. So the why question is absolutely critical, and it's almost like surfacing your day-to-day or your what he would call local business decisions with that kind of context in mind. And I think that's something that the RAF is very much working on.
It is, and I really like that, because I mean, certainly when I joined the Air Force, I think we used to have a 10-year strategy. I mean, that would be laughable now, wouldn't it? Because you have no idea what it's going to be like in 3 years' time, let alone 10 years' time. So I really like this sense of the why and the purpose that can almost be sort of your guiding light. That changes less, doesn't it? Your purpose, your reason for being, the why. And if you're really clear on that, I feel that in these really ambiguous and complex times, that could perhaps give you a little bit of a pathway to follow. So it's really interesting.
So. And of course, the second consequence that derives directly from that, and it's partly down to something that he highlighted as the increasing speed required of decisions. That he put it as strategy and execution now just being actually the same thing, that we know the classic models that we had in strategy courses, and he talked about how. Therefore, what you do in terms of decision making is work really carefully on how you're both assigning new capabilities to your strategic projects and how you allocate scarce resources to those projects. And again, I know that this is something that the RF has very much been working on.
Yeah, do you know, I really identify with it, because the resources are scarce, aren't they? You know, and how you prioritise and how you target them. And space and cyber are really obvious examples within the Air Force of areas we're really expanding and trying to build and grow those capabilities and resources. And also trying to bring in resources. So the Air Force is looking at things like lateral entry, bringing people in rather than always being a bottom-fed organisation, to bring in those resources and capabilities. So it's definitely something I recognise within our own organisation.
Oh, very much so. It's a really good example, I think, of what Blair was talking about. And this idea of the speed or agility of decision-making was also picked up, I think, by a couple of our other interviewers. And that, of course, the COVID crisis has I think, as many would recognise, has really highlighted that. And we had Soraya Marshall, Commandant of Cranwell, talking about this idea of the agility required and the speed of decision making, but also being able to combine that with oversight and consultation in those decisions and trying to get that balance right. So perhaps we'll hear from Soraya just talking a little bit more about how she responded to that.
We had to make a whole range of decisions in those sort of early days. The first one being we've got to try and continue, but how do we continue? And then finally, the decision to stop a proportion of training and refocus our efforts. Again, difficult. There wasn't a lot of evidence. There was, it was very reactive. There was a lot of ambiguity. You kind of were weighing in all of these different inputs, trying to understand people's reactions. Some people wanted really, really clear direction. Other people were really happy to work in ambiguity. Other people just wanted to go home and shut their doors and wait till the whole thing was over. I think, so many different decisions were made in those first few weeks, some bad, but then we reversed the decisions and we sort of pivoted and did something different. And I think there were a whole host of lessons in there. There was sort of intuition, there was trying to get the evidence, but then actually making decisions before you had the evidence because it just felt wrong and we had to do something else. There was a sort of hearts and minds bit, trying to sort of keep everybody on board. And reassure everybody. So a huge amount sort of wrapped up in there. A huge amount of consultation as well with the team. There was very much a sense of trying to find our way through it. Yeah. And a recognition that some people were really, really uncomfortable with ambiguity. They just wanted to be told exactly what they should do and how they should do it.
And when you hear Commandant Cranwell talk about that, it really is playing out in real time. Blair's point about strategy and execution overlaying. Yeah. You are writing the strategy, you're coming up with the why and what we're trying to do at the same time as enacting and living it. And that's a really interesting area, isn't it, right now?
Yeah, very much so. So coming back to our theme of the context, Emma, I think the other key, one of the other key themes of context was a political context, which again very relevant for the Royal Air Force. And so we had DCOM Ops Jerry Mayhew talking about how he builds in the political context that he operates inside into the way he makes decisions and how he incorporates them into his decisions, but doesn't necessarily hide behind the political context, and therefore also sets the right context for the rest of his organisation. So that, I think, was also a really important point about the context. So we'll hear Jerry talking about his approach to the politics of decision making.
I think some decisions that the tactical corporal or the operational air marshal will make that will affect a government, it's not an irregular thing. We will be doing things in the world that will affect how the Prime Minister and his government on this occasion will be seen. And therefore, there is inevitably some element of senior official or ministerial oversight into quite a lot of what we see. Not in the detail, but again, there's that intent from politics has to be there for us to be able to make those decisions. So I'm not nervous of that. I'm aware of it. And that awareness allows me to make some of the decisions I do make, which can seem a bit odd to the organisation sometimes.
Because you know of the political dimensions of the decisions that you're having to make.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'll try and explain that to the echelons of the organisation that don't have that exposure, in order that they've got the context to make the subsequent decisions in their part of the organisation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, it's to this point that we're not operating in isolation, are we? We all have, this political atmosphere within environment within which we operate. And it's a challenge for leaders, isn't it, to make sure that those people below them understand, because sometimes these decisions can look strange to them if they don't understand the full nature of the environment or the context that the decisions are being made in. At a different level, you can be thinking, why on earth are they doing that? I don't understand it.
Indeed. And he said where he can, of course, he does his best to explain that. Yeah. And one of the things that he highlighted then is that actually it provides a better context for the rest of his organisation to be able to make their decisions if they understand why those sometimes slightly bizarre decisions that they hear about, why those have been made, as well as the fact that they've been made. So that process of communication is, I think, also a really important part of that context, that political context.
Yeah, absolutely. Really interesting. And then I know we also heard from Clive, and he talked a lot about the moral and ethical element around these decisions.
Yeah, it's particularly important for Clive's organisation. So Clive is the CEO of De La Rue, operates in many countries around the world. They essentially print money.
I wish I could.
He's the one person who says he can do that for his job. Yeah. And so Clive was very clear about the need to have, in terms of the context, the need to have really rigorous and clear processes and structures and policies around the must-dos and the will-dos, if you like, those questions, for his leaders to be able to operate within. So clearly what he doesn't want to do is to decide how they make their decisions, but he really needs to be clear about what sorts of things that they can and can't do in that process. So it's setting those boundaries and then giving them the space to operate inside. And that's a really interesting point in those.
Yeah, so that really resonates with me, because what you've described is effectively what the Air Force would call mission command, which is where that you give your intent. So there's very clear boundaries about, what can and can't happen. So clear policies, as he said, he does in the different countries. He has these policies that oversee all that. So very clear about what, very clear about why, but leaving the actual how it's achieved to the people on the ground, because in different countries it might require a different perspective. And the Air Force would do the same thing across the organisation, or aim to, and we'll talk about that perhaps a little more later, that it's very easy to talk about and perhaps a little harder to enact, but that mission command of the what and the why and letting people do the how is very important.
Indeed. And so we'll hear Clive talking about what he characterises as staying away from the grey.
We have a central set of policies and procedures that regardless of the country we're operating in, are must-haves, must-dos. So there is a certain framework within that, a factory manager or a country manager is able to operate within. Okay. Now, individual of each circumstance of each country, culture of each country is radically different, and therefore how we approach the subject within that. So the power is within the local application of a global policy, and that local application allows for quite a bit of flexibility to ensure that whatever we provide, goods or services, is culturally appropriate, is applicable to the circumstances of that country, but never breaching overall guidelines. And that's everything related to ethics, diversity, respect, bribery, corruption, and so on. And in fact, we're very proud of the fact that we participate in countries that are unstable, countries, in trying to provide stable monetary systems into war-torn countries. It's a very, very important role that we play. And therefore, we absolutely cannot stray into any grey area when it comes to ethics or any sort of lack of respect for anything in those countries. But what we're finding is that we're able to help those countries in their development by being able to bring a very strong set of values to the table in everything that we do.
So the final context that we want to explore is the cultural one, which is clearly critical for all decision making, actually, let alone in a global context. And one of our respondents, Simon Dowling, who spent part of his tours in NATO, described how when you have 28 nations, as it was at that time, trying to make decisions, how culture played into that, and what role stereotyping, for example, played both as an advantage and potentially a disadvantage to the decision-making process.
You learn what people are like, and then you learn how to work around it. It's more likely, in my opinion, that if somebody is conforming to a stereotype, that if you aren't aware of it, that it will damage the situation because you're not aware of it. Leveraging it to your advantage is actually more of a second level skill, if you like. If you know how people maybe think, or when they think certain things, when is the best time to approach them in the best manner, definitely it might help. But to not be aware that the way you might approach somebody because of the way they are culturally will be detrimental is much more likely. The Spanish have a phrase, Flemma Britannica, which just means that the stereotypical British person, if you like. For example, one of the things that includes is being punctual. Because in Spain, you're invited for dinner at 7, which you would 9 instead of 7 as you would in the UK, perhaps. If you turn up at 9, they'll just laugh because nobody else will turn up until 9:30.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? And hearing Simon's points, particularly, he's worked in lots of these environments, and sort of stereotypes are really interesting, aren't they? Because we all probably do them unconsciously. We're all probably aware of them. And they present an opportunity and a challenge, don't they? And I think being really aware of what's going on in your own mind when you're creating those stereotypes and why, but also being really aware that they're being made of you too, because we tend to do it to everybody else, don't we? It's a bit like everybody else has an accent, whereas being aware of the stereotypes that you're portraying or people are making of you is interesting.
Quite interesting to hear Simon talking about the way the others thought about the Brits in that NATO context. And he's saying it's almost a necessary condition, and we all do it. It's a natural thing that we stereotype. But in terms of the decision-making process, it becomes less useful when you really do have to know the nuances and actually the individual characteristics of the people that you're working with. So it's a start point, but it certainly isn't the end point in terms of informing effective decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And could also be very dangerous as well, couldn't it? If the person is actually very different to the stereotype, they could feel very contained by your perception.
Absolutely right. Yes, indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you.
So that's, in a sense, the first part of the results of the interviews, Emma. And so the next part, we then started to move on to how some senior leaders structured decision-making at a strategic level in their organisations, so that their organisations were being effective in the way that they made their decisions. So that really was the sort of second part of the respondents' theme.
And that's really important, isn't it? Because we have this big global context, but you're sat there going, okay, but what so what does that mean for me? What do I actually do within my organisation, or what does the organisation do? And I think we had Diane Lees who spoke a little bit about the criticality of transparency and transparency around decision making.
She did, and so Diane Lees is the managing director of the Imperial War Museum, and so she indeed talked about being having real clarity on the governance of decisions, and indeed transparency about where levels of authority and ownership of decisions, and literally thousands of decisions being made in an organisation, where the ownership and the clarity for everybody about who was making those decisions at a particular given time and who had authority for them. That was one of the really critical points that she was making. So we'll just listen to Di talking about that.
But I think it's really important for staff to understand where those decisions are made as well. So the idea of a very clear governance structure that clearly articulates where decisions are made and who is accountable for those decisions is absolutely critical. And then the kind of counterpoint to that is that a lot of people see accountability or decision making as relying on process. And I think it's really important that process supports the decision making as opposed to kind of abdicates the responsibility for actually making the decisions, which is, you get a tick box. Well, we've had it a long time in our organisation with copyright, which is, if we don't have copyright, we do not use the image, and you tick this box. Whereas actually what we would prefer people to do is to say, can we identify the copyright? We really want to use this image. It's really important to the public, and to take that kind of reliance on the process out of it as well. So it's a combination of factors about kind of clarity around your governance structure and making sure the right people have the right conversations at the right time.
And I think one of the really interesting points that she has made as well here, isn't it, is around this not hiding behind the process. Yeah. So she references, doesn't she, that actually copyright, as an example, could be the first barrier to using something, to using a piece of material, and you could just simply say, okay, well, we can't use that then, rather than actually looking at, well, how do I challenge this? How do I get around it? How do I speak to the right people? And that's something that I can recognise actually across the Air Force as well, is, making sure that we don't use our policies to prevent things. We write the policies, often the internal policies. And so if they're not meeting the needs, we should be challenging those and looking at why and not hiding behind them.
Well, very much so. And of course, staying within the law naturally. And it was a really interesting example of where being clear on the purpose, the service that they need to provide to a client, in her case, and being creative about how to find a solution rather than just deciding not to do it because there's the policy that we can, as you say, Emma, hide behind. And she was really clear that her organisational culture is to try and find creative solutions for the clients and not simply hide behind that in the decisions.
Which is really interesting, isn't it? And then I know we were talking about Mission Command earlier, and Commandant Cranwell touched on an interesting point with this as well, didn't she? Which is that it's really easy to talk about with many of these things like leadership, isn't it? It's really easy to talk about and say what should be done, and so much harder to enact and live it, because everybody in your organisation is different. And some people will absolutely thrive in an environment of mission command and empowerment, and they want that freedom to make the decisions. Yeah. What's interesting is that, as Commandant Cranwell references, that some people don't like that. Some people don't want to be given that responsibility. They feel uncomfortable with it. And actually then they naturally keep passing their decisions back up the chain. And so there's something interesting there, isn't there, in making sure that the decisions you're putting to them are appropriate. They are trained. They have got the right resources, that they are in the right space to make those decisions. I think that's an interesting tension.
It certainly is, and it's a really critical point, and we'll come on a little bit later to talk about the preparation and the rehearsal for decision-making process. But Soraya was very clear in how she wants to create, and her intent is to create a culture where people can feel like they can actually make the wrong decision and actually not be punished for it, or it not be detrimental to their career. And she really felt that was a really critical part about their ability to take responsibility under the mission command structure. And she was very clear about that. And also, of course, not necessarily rely on the fact that they're always going to make exactly the decision that you would expect them to make, because you've possibly been there, done that, and got the t-shirt, as they say. So she's very clear also about making different decisions and allowing their ability to be able to do that. And that is, in a sense, a cultural thing as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. And actually, isn't that also where innovation comes from? Because actually, if everybody's making the decisions that the previous commander made and it's gone through, we're not getting that diversity of thought or innovation, are we? So actually allowing people to make it brings new perspectives forward as well, which is really interesting. We then were hearing, I think, from Clive Asher was talking about red teaming and the organisational structure that he had put in place. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, certainly, Emma. So we had a couple of senior leaders who, in their organisations, that they were in a position where they were transforming their organisation. So we had two quite interesting cases about how they created a decision-making structure as a transformational tool for their organisations, both actually with the theme of empowerment, which we were picking up on in the mission command conversation. So Clive, as CEO of De La Rue, I think in the RF terms would call it a red team. He constructed a team of 18 senior people who were representative of his whole organisation, early days in terms of his appointment into De La Rue. And what they did was they created spent a lot of time on it actually, but then for around 3 months, they had a lot of time spent on both defining the why, thinking a lot about the why. Why were they there as an organisation? What were they there to do? So back to that why question. But I think more importantly also coming up with quite a rigorous decision-making process between them that both allowed them to consult with the organisation, but also was rigorous internally in terms of reviewing data and evidence first and then making decisions after that. So it was this really interesting combination of the why purpose linked to the needs to get some strategic decisions made and a process of consultation and empowerment. So we'll just hear Clive talking about that process in some detail.
But then we settled down into figuring out how to turn a company that had been declining for many years into a really positively growing, sustainable business for the future. And that's where the whole decision-making process came into its own. And I would characterize it in a number of ways. One is that you want to try and harness the intelligence of the organization in the decision-making process. So we formulated a team of 18 key leaders in the business. And we made a commitment that once we had got the basic survival in place, we would then spend 3 months together with a commitment of 12 hours together a week to dissect every part of the business and come up with a turnaround plan. And in that process, we brought the organization a singular vision, and we were able together to make the right decisions about what we were going to drop and what we were going to focus on and how we would spend our investment and how we would turn this business around. And so it was very much a shared decision-making process due to everybody's input. And that's the way I like to make decisions, is with the input from all angles of the organization, because that is, I think, when you do the right diligence on coming to the right solutions.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? The fact that he's, intentionally put this process in, so something really quite structured around the decision making, and back to the transparency and all of these other words that we've heard earlier. And he talks, doesn't he, a little bit about separating the facts from the emotions. And I find that really interesting because clearly it's something that is, really interesting to look at, isn't it? Because do your emotions help you with the decisions? Because we'll come to this gut instinct that I will probably talk about later when we talk about the individual. But also, if we're saying emotions aren't useful in decision making, how do you park them? It's a real challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely right. And actually, I don't think you can at an individual level. And it's often, I think, a false dichotomy between evidence and intuition, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. But in his context, he was talking about a decision-making process where he was really clear with his team that there were 2 stages to that process. And the first was this need to rely on evidence and data and analysis and keep that actually quite distinct. It's not that you're suspending emotions, but you're actually taking that as first stage of the process. And having done that, that's the point when you bring in your opinion and your discussion about how you see that evidence. And I thought that was a really interesting distinction to make when you're thinking particularly about the strategic decisions. Not saying suspend emotion, but in terms of a process, I thought that was quite an interesting distinction.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And then another area that stood out to me as we were looking at this organisational context was around values, which is very interesting within the Air Force because we do have very strong organisational values. So we have RISE, respect, integrity, service and excellence. And I was really interested in a comment that Amanda Fisher actually made around values.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could expand on that.
Well, sure. So Amanda Fisher is CEO of Amy. Similar situation to Clive, actually. She took over an organisation where transformation was an objective. And she indeed spent time thinking through, when she was putting that structure in place, about clearly how the values question could be incorporated into the decision-making process. She came up with an interesting decision herself. She decided on principles. So she identified 3 principles by which all decisions should be filtered through, in a sense, rather than values. And the point that she made was that principles can be owned by an organisation, where values tend to be an individual question. So I thought that was quite an interesting take or nuance on the question of how you build that question of the values into your decision-making process. So we can hear from Amanda just talking about that.
The beginning of COVID, we launched our new strategy, which was as simple as freedom to perform. And what we did was realise that historically the organisation was making the decisions from the top down. And then what I did was reverse that and said the people who are best placed to make the decisions are at the front end of the business. They're the ones with the information at the time. They're the ones that can make the appropriate decisions, in the moment and for the client. So we launched Freedom to Perform, which gave the framework, but also responsibility and accountability for making those decisions that they believed were right. And then we underpinned those by guiding principles. I sort of moved away from values and said that values are personal to individuals, whereas guiding principles help you, understand how we are as an organisation. And we had those as empowerment, engagement, and to excel. And that's really changed the way that the organisation now sort of addresses actually decision making, I suppose, because they're feeling more empowered rather than to have to go up to the top.
Yeah, I agree. I find that really, really interesting because we have principles as well in the Air Force, because we agree that principles are unchanging. So that, they are there, they are embedded. Principles do not change in the organisation, and so we have those at the centre. We've put them at the centre of our organisational model. But I really find this interesting about values, whether they're personal or organisational, because, for example, integrity, which is one of the services values, you and I could both say that we are making a decision from the point of integrity, but make a very different decision because we're placing that integrity in a different place. So
and it doesn't mean to say either of us doesn't have integrity, but it does, I think, does play in a little bit more into the way that you make a decision personally, as opposed to an organisational structure where you're building in that process into your decision making. So that principles idea was quite an interesting one, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, I agree. Fascinating. And then cognitive diversity came up in these sessions as well, and obviously this is something that is being talked about widely, at the moment, diversity and inclusion and the cognitive diversity that you get from that. And I thought that Commandant Cranwell made a really interesting point around this, where her comment around if the majority are making the decisions unintentionally, that can lead to the minority having unintended consequences.
Very much so. And actually, I think Soraya, of course, particularly given her EDI role and responsibility and how seriously she takes that, was very clear that you need to be challenged by diversity in your decision-making process, because we all have our own particular worldview. We all have our unconscious bias. And she really emphasized that it's the cognitive diversity, that a process of scrutiny of your decisions and consultation on decisions with those who are different than you and have a different worldview than you is absolutely crucial in being able to test your own worldview and whether you are in fact bringing an unconscious bias into your decision-making process. So she builds that into her thinking about how she takes organizational decisions, and that's a really critical point. And we'll just hear Soraya maybe talking about that because it's such an important point.
being able to consider all perspectives in decision making at whatever level is a really, really key part to being more inclusive as an organisation, and ultimately not, having those unintended consequences of disenfranchising the minority, and also improving the quality of your decision making. And of course, you roll that across to the operational output of what the Air Force delivers, and it means that we're more able to understand how our adversaries might think, how threats might impact us, how our decisions, may alter and affect the enemy, etc., etc. So it is absolutely that cognitive diversity.
And we also heard from about building in challenge as part of the process, and this idea of an unwritten contract. And I just wondered again if you could expand on that.
Absolutely. So this was Rear Admiral Andy Kite, who is the Assistant Chief of Staff for Logs, and Andy was again referring to the idea of evidence and analysis, but actually the challenge part, which came through actually many of our interviews, they all said that challenge has to be in that decision-making process somewhere, within constraints, of course. And he presented in this idea of this unwritten, of course, contract between you and your team or the individuals who are working for you that works in both directions. So we often hear about allowing junior people to challenge more senior people in their decisions, absolutely rightly. But he also reversed it and said, you know what, you need to be prepared to receive challenge from me as well. So let's hear Andy talking about that particular part of his decision making.
You have to be fair to your people by saying, right, are you comfortable that you can make these decisions? It's got to be almost a sort of contract between you and your subordinates that says, right, this is the sort of envelope within which I would like you to operate. Are you content that you can do this? And the best people, I think, in that empowerment relationship are those that challenge. And you come right full circle to the challenge function, which again is absolutely central. You've got to be able to challenge in both directions, so that you are exploring all your options and not going down a blind alley, for example.
Yes, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's really easy to always look upwards about what you want from a boss, a line manager, that you want to be able to challenge. It takes much more self-reflection and awareness to be thinking about, okay, but that means I need to be prepared to be challenged, and how do I cope with that? How do I invite it? How do I keep that in a healthy way? Because as we all know, in any healthy relationship, these things should be, healthily balanced, shouldn't they?
They totally should. And actually, particularly where there is a discrepancy in hierarchy or rank, for example, I think it's really important that leaders take that opportunity to discuss that and agree that with their team. And I think that was Andy's point about this contract. He clearly has that conversation to say, look, here's how we're going to work in terms of decision making. And having that pre-agreement stops that challenge becoming as a complete surprise, I think.
So now if we could move on to a really interesting case study, which is Navdeep Arora, who was a previous partner at McKinsey. And his story is obviously a really interesting story. Navdeep was actually sent to prison for fraud, and during his time and since then has studied a PhD looking at the organisational and personal factors that contributed to it. And his study looks much broader than his own circumstance. So there's some really great evidence and research there, and a lot of self-reflection. And he talks about this sort of requirement almost for oversight and for others to challenge decisions where there's a lot of ethics involved. I just wondered if you could expand.
Indeed, you're absolutely right. It's really interesting to have that, very rare actually, to have that kind of case evidence to inform our discussion. So fascinating interview. And there were several themes that he's developed in his research, which would be very interesting for our listeners to listen to. But I think the two things that he mentioned that I think were particularly striking, and as you say, one is that often decision-making can feel like a very isolated experience. And one of the characteristics he identified was that sense of isolation. The need to take the decision on your own without consultation was one of the factors that led him through this process that ended up in being in fraud. So allowing others and consulting with others was one of the foils that he identified as minimizing the chances of that decision process going wrong. So that challenge again, but also the feeling that you're not alone in your decisions, no matter how senior you feel. Doesn't mean to say you don't take ownership of the decision, but that process of engaging others in the decision-making process was indeed one of the items.
And I think what was fascinating about what he said was it doesn't necessarily need to be ownership of other people in the company. He actually referenced, didn't he, even if I had mentioned this to my family, they would have said,
yes,
what are you doing?
Yes.
That's wrong. So even exposing it anywhere to anybody else gives you a different perspective.
And indeed, you could argue that exposing it to people who aren't involved in your situation, who can actually take that slightly external, slightly impartial view of the situation you're faced in, can indeed be an advantage in that process. Yes, very much.
So it's really fascinating, isn't it? Navdeep's study really sparks my thinking, because he's a fundamentally good person from everything I know of him, and he has made bad decisions. So it's what makes or allows good people to make bad decisions is really, really interesting. And one of the things he talked about that really kind of resonated with me was this idea of actually really needing to know and understand the policies. And he talks about the fact there had been a lot of transformation, policies had changed a lot, and he wasn't placing blame. He's always very clear in his discussions that he doesn't place blame, but he's looked at the factors, and again, broader than just his case, that a number of people in his study referenced that the policies changing so fast. And the Air Force is going through this huge transformation, as are many organisations, as we try to keep up with the changing global context and technology. And so our policies are changing rapidly, often for really good reasons, and with really great impact, particularly things like flexible working, these great changes. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? That how do you make sure, therefore, that people understand them? They know which lines have changed. It's really interesting.
Totally, and it was one of the 6 themes, and we'll listen to Navdeep describing them in a second. But of course, the Air Force is in that situation, and many organisations would recognise similar factors. And what he's not doing is it excusing you from knowing what they are. What he's saying is actually it just makes your decision-making process more complex, and you absolutely have to be really crystal clear that you are up to date on whatever the policies are applying to your decisions, so that you keep yourself straight on those red lines, as it were.
And one of the other points that I heard him say, which again I really was interested in, was he was talking about highly regulated organisations. Yeah. Now, clearly, we're a government organisation. We are highly regulated, and safety aspects of flying, etc. But he talked about actually if you're so highly regulated that you almost can't do your job without putting your toe on a red line, because actually the constraints are such that you can't operate. He made an interesting point around where if you touch your toe on the red line, it becomes easier to cross it. And that was, again, a really interesting area to consider, isn't it? Because we have these lines to prevent this happening, but if they are too tight, people can't operate and they almost sleepwalk over it.
Indeed. So policymakers, it's actually reflecting back to what Clive was saying earlier about making sure that you've got those policies in place, but you still give people space to make their own decisions within those guidelines, staying away from the grey, as he called it. So perhaps we'll listen to Navdeep just talking a little bit about that, because it's such an important point.
The 5th one is a lack of information capacity and capability to respond to mistakes. And I think our observation has been that the boundaries, the regulatory boundaries, are shifting so quickly that it actually creates a lot of confusion at times vis-a-vis what is wrong and what is not wrong, what is legal. And what is actually on the verge of illegal. So there are several examples. Physicians who were practicing pain medication in certain states in the US, they were permitted by state regulations the use of opioids. But then suddenly, due to political headwinds, opioids became a big no-no, and the usage was declared a federal crime. So there were people who were sent to prison because what they were doing was a crime federally, but not a crime in their local state.
So our 3rd key theme from the interviews was really coming down to the individual focus, and often what goes on quite deeply internal processes or mechanisms for individual decision making. And of course, we were very lucky to have a sports psychologist, Kate Goodyear, who has as a profession the ability to assist elite sportsmen and women with their decision-making process.
Yeah, and I really loved this interview with Kate, because I think sometimes, you want to know, so what as an individual? So what do I actually do? Yeah. And I really liked her comments about sports people actually really chasing feedback. Actually was really interesting to me, really running towards the feedback because they knew it would enhance their performance. But being really clear on this why were they doing it, on their direction. Yeah. And she referenced a book that we both really liked the sound of, which is, Will It Make the Boat Go Faster? Which is a lovely phrase, isn't it? Easy to remember. And, are your actions helping you move in the right direction?
Absolutely right. It is back to that purpose thing, but almost the sense of individual purpose and being really clear on that. I spent a lot of time working with athletes on that question of why. And her key point is, in your decision-making process, be really clear about, are you making the boat go faster in your context? Is it actually helping with whatever performance it is that you're trying to achieve or not? And if it isn't, you need to ask yourself, well, why are you actually doing it?
And the other bit that she covered that I found fascinating, it's an area of interest for me actually, is this difference between internal and external motivation. And I know this from a case study where Cathy Freeman, who's an athlete of Aboriginal descent who was in the Sydney Olympics, and she had an awful lot of pressure on her to achieve. It was the International Year of the Woman. She was of Aboriginal descent. She would have been the first female Aboriginal to win her event. And huge pressure on her. And if you watch this clip on YouTube, when she wins the gold, which she wins, she breaks down and is comforted by the person who got silver. Right. Very unusual. And she talks afterwards about she was running for everybody else. She was running for all of these external reasons, and she was deeply unhappy. And she actually never ran another race. Whereas Ian Thorpe, the swimmer, when he was interviewed around internal versus external motivation, he talked about the fact he's never lost, and the person interviewing them was laughing, saying, well, I'm sorry to disempower you on this, but you have. And he said, oh, no. You're thinking of it in a different way. I only compete against myself. I have my plan. I enact my plan. And if I do that well, I've won. And to me, this was so powerful, this difference between what is driving you and how much more effective it can be if it is internally driven. And I thought that was fascinating.
Oh, totally. And she talked almost exactly those words, Emma, about if you're motivated by the medal, then that becomes emotional labor, emotional work, which can distract you actually from your performance. Whereas if you develop your own internal goals, and she mentioned be the best you can be, that sort of however you define that, then it becomes a much more logical and structured process of decision making. So really important point. So let's hear Kate talking about that particular point.
What anchors them ultimately is the reference point for the decision making. So there's a great book by Ben Hunt Davis, an Olympic rower, and he simply asks one question: will this make the boat go faster? And it's a fantastic performance question, because if it's not helping you, or it's depleting energy and it's not aiding performance, then don't do it, then get rid of it. So a really important piece of work for athletes is to be abundantly clear on what they're trying to achieve and what that really means for them. And most people would go, well, it's an Olympic gold medal, isn't it? But actually there's a lot more behind that in terms of what does that mean to the athlete, because that affects decision making. If an athlete is attaching identity and self-worth to the medal, lots of the decision making will be more emotional in nature. Whereas if an athlete is about, this is me challenging myself to be the very best I can be, there's sometimes more objectivity around that decision making. So what links both of those domains is the clarity of focus of what ultimately are we trying to achieve here. And it's interesting, athletes that I've come across over the years, when you say, what's the mountain here? What's the thing that we're really aiming for? And they'll say, well, I think I should probably aim for the Olympics. And as soon as they use that word should, it becomes really interesting, because that's really different from athletes that are like really wired to, I want to perform at the Olympics. I want to see the best that's out there and how I match against them. So it's really important to get that clarity of what's this person's mission, purpose, anchor that they're working towards.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, isn't it? And I think one of the other areas she touched upon, which links to my feedback comment earlier about chasing the feedback, she talks about this test and learn and really seeking the evidence to match against your instinct. So you really are looking, at what you need to adjust, what you need to change, quite intentionally looking for the evidence. And I thought that was interesting.
A lot of detail when it comes to sports people, indeed. But of course, Kate's great strength, one of her great strengths, is being able to translate those lessons into organisations. And we had one or two of our senior leaders talking in very similar terms about evidence and data and the role that it plays. So what Dailise said is that she builds into that decision-making process clear authority for the data. Sounds simple, but every business case that gets presented to her as the senior leader in the organisation has to be signed off by finance to show that the numbers that she's seeing has the authority, if you like, the subject matter expert. And that kind of identification of the authority for evidence, I thought, was a really interesting point.
Completely. It's the credibility of the evidence, isn't it? It's like the, statistics and lies, the wrong evidence, if it's not interrogated, could take you down the wrong path. And I think another interesting angle with evidence is also, if you've made a decision or are making one but have a strong leaning, if you search for evidence to support that, you'll find it, won't you? So an idea that I've heard before, which I quite like, is actually intentionally searching for evidence to counter your decision, because you're more likely to really search in quite a different way. And there was something in that for me as well, versus looking for something to confirm your decision. Look for something to challenge it and just check yourself.
Yeah, very much so. And that's also part of what a lot of our leaders have said about having people who can look at the position very differently from you and present those alternative aspects of evidence. Andy Kite talked about having different SMEs, subject matter experts, who can present evidence, but also interpret that evidence as well as a key skill. And he talked about. So perhaps we'll just hear from Di talking about that point about the role evidence plays in decision making.
I'm really keen on clarity. So that, sort of where there is guidance in the organisation or there are processes, that there's kind of clear guidance to staff about those levels of authority. So, for example, in the organisation, there's a rule which is that you can't submit a set of figures for a business case without it being signed off from the finance department. And that sounds like a really simple process, but actually the number of people who will try and convince you that they've got a really good business case for something and that the return on investment will be absolutely brilliant, but the finance department will then tell you there's 10 sets of overheads they haven't kind of counted into their budget. So again, it's kind of how the system then backs up the quality of evidence that you get. And so that kind of the authority over the data is quite important as well.
And I think one of the things we have to talk about here, it's probably a bit of the elephant in the room when we're talking about individual decision making, but it is this gut instinct versus evidence. And you'll have some people argue you should really follow your gut, listen to your instincts. And then other people who'll say, well, actually your instinct can really trick you, it's got the biases, it's, the situation might be different in front of you. And there's this really interesting tension between the two. And I just wondered what your thoughts, having listened to all of these different people, were around that.
I think everybody mentioned that both play a key role in the decision-making process, both evidence and intuition. And I think they have to, one of the conclusions seems to be that they have to be framed. So you use both in that process. But we had one or two senior leaders, for example, saying that, often, particularly with experience and expertise, you often sort of know or feel what the right decision is likely to be, and that intuition does indeed play a key role. And I think there were two important aspects of that. So perhaps we'll hear from Amanda Fisher, who talked about emotional intelligence, actually, and how she uses intuition in the decision-making process.
I've always worked on informed decision making, always, and I do look at the data, I look at facts, and I seek advisors or information to help get to the complex decisions. However, I think through experience, I also know myself very well, and this is where your emotional intelligence kicks in, and if you get this sixth sense or this feeling, I've learned over the time to go with that. When you get to a point with it's a fine line, should I, shouldn't I, then I do listen to my sixth sense. And I think that, I found that, as I said, from my sort of military training, really helped me with that. Once I've thought through the situation and that decisive, I've learned that if something doesn't feel right or it doesn't appear right, then normally it isn't right.
So it seems it's really important, isn't it, to be aware of this gut instinct, and actually it can be really valuable to you, but where you've got the time, where you've got the opportunity to red team it yourself, check the evidence, and to just question yourself about why you're making that decision.
So it's not coming into unconscious bias playing a role, or your own biased worldview. So use the intuition, but bound it.
Yeah, and also not making the context fit it. So, quite often you might hear people say, well, that didn't work when we did it before, but actually the context might have changed. You might roll the same plan out now, and it's a completely different context. So it's kind of questioning yourself, isn't it, around why you're saying what you're saying and what's coming out.
And I'm reminded that actually intuition, it's been studied as actually, in fact, what it is. It's a subconscious role that your five senses are playing, and they're informing your process, and that's why it comes off as intuition or as a feeling. In fact, actually your senses are telling you something subconsciously, so it absolutely has a role, and we had a really good example of that, didn't we, in terms of someone doing that on the ground, as it were.
Absolutely. So that brings us on nicely to Ali Beer, who operates on the Mountain Rescue Services in the Air Force. And he had a really interesting case study, well, a couple of them actually, hasn't he, where he's been out on the mountain dealing with an incident, and he spoke to us about that tension and difference between his training that he's done to tell him what to do when he's out there versus the dynamic situation and his instinct on the day. And I think there was a really nice clip, wasn't there, where he's talking about how he had to just make that decision. And perhaps it would be interesting to listen to that now.
Let's hear Ali now.
Key thing is to manage the balance between gathering as much information as possible to make the correct decision, but you have to weigh that against the time you've got available to you. So you're sometimes better off with an imperfect decision made at the perfect time, rather than waiting a longer period to gain all the information for the gold standard decision and solution. Because by then, especially in a time critical case, it could actually be too late.
Right.
So sometimes a slightly wrong decision or a not perfect decision early is better than waiting to gain all the information you need.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting comment, isn't it, about, we could aim for the gold standard. He's got his training, but his instinct was that he needed to make a decision. He needed to move forward. And if we extrapolate that out to a broader perspective, as a decision maker, we could often be there trying to collate as much evidence, as much information as we can until we can make a perfect decision, by which point the decision point has passed. And in Ali's case, perhaps your patient has died. So there's an interesting angle there, isn't there?
Very much so. And you that was a really interesting microcosm of the training and preparation and skill that leads up to the decision. So it's not just doing this as a novice. So there's all that training that goes into that moment. There is the understanding and recognition of what he refers to as the gold standard. There's the consultation part. So he's not doing this on his own, but he takes ownership of that decision. And then there's that final part, which is, actually, you know what, I need to do this. I need to adjust the gold standard a bit. And that's what's going to work in this particular case. And take the risk. He was taking the risk because he could have done serious damage or even fatal harm to the patient. It was great that actually it worked and the patient survived. So that combination of things is really nicely illustrated in that particular case.
He talked about emotions, didn't he, as well? I thought it was really telling that he said at the end it was one of the worst handovers he's done in the hospital. And he talks about actually being quite embarrassed about that later. Because it was, in the second case, it was one of his colleagues that he had been taking and treating, and that personal connection had really impacted his emotions. And he was very honest about the impact of his own feelings on his decision-making on that day. And he felt he wasn't being as creative in his thinking because he was, panicking to a degree. And I thought that was really, really honest of him, and it certainly happens to lots of people.
It was a really a quite powerful account, actually, that of a decision he had to make with one of his own colleagues who was taken seriously ill. And again, the colleague survived. He did what was necessary, but he felt that he was too emotionally involved in the decision-making process. So it's a great example of the real difficulty sometimes in separating yourself from the facts and the evidence and becoming too emotionally involved in the decision that you're making. So it was a really good account of that indeed.
Fascinating. And then just to sort of, wrap this little section up, one of the things that really stands out to me about Ali's situation with the gentleman who had fallen down the ditch, and that he had to make the decision to move forward, not wait for the gold standard, is this point around, actually, if you shy away from making the decision, it's understanding that no decision is still a decision, and that still has consequences. So sometimes I think people are scared of making a decision, they're scared of moving forward, but they don't acknowledge staying here in this position has its own consequences, and recognising that.
Indeed, Emma, and actually the particular case that we've just analysed, I think quite nicely links to really the fourth part of our analysis, and that is the consequences of these data for leaders themselves. And we referred at the start of our discussion to Blair, who described 4 global crises that informed decision making. The fourth of those crises is a crisis of leadership that he defined. And he talked about 6 paradoxes that leaders are now faced with when it comes to decision making. It's quite an interesting way of thinking about the effects of this on leadership generally. So, for example, one of those paradoxes that he defined is for leaders having to be both courageous and humble at the same time, almost. And if you think about what Ali was doing, he was the humility of recognizing the limitations of what he had, but the courage actually to make the decision, or as you described, not to make the decision. So it's a really nice little illustration, quite a rare set of combinations for our leaders to know to develop. And he talked about 5 other paradoxes for leadership that perhaps we'll just now hear Blair describing himself.
We're in a world which is really ambiguous, where there's huge interdependencies in the issues, because the 3 crises I described roll over each other. You can't solve one without solving them all, right? And they happen really fast. So the kind of leader we used to have, we can no longer afford. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Think about the best leader you know of through COVID. I'm willing to bet they did 2 things really well. They were incredibly humble in their acknowledgement they had no idea how to deal with this issue. So they sought input from lots of people, right? Epidemiologists, public health officials, economists, business people, politicians, and then probably even psychologists about what's going to work and what's not going to work as an intervention method. And I guarantee you, when they got all that input, they had no idea what the right answer was. So they're humble enough to define the problem, but courageous enough to take a decision in spite of that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then humble in acknowledging all the ways in which that was wrong and correcting course. Now, question for you: how many people do you know are humble and heroic at the same time?
Yes, it's a very small number.
The second one is they were technically capable, because there's a lot of, which epidemiological survey do I believe? Is the vaccine going to happen? How does it work? It's actually, there's some deep technology in that. Yeah. But they also understood they were operating in human systems. And so, the person who understands the vaccine but didn't know how to get people to take it isn't very helpful. The person who understands how to get people to take it but don't understand the vaccine isn't very helpful. So they have to be technology savvy humanists. Now I ask you, how many PhDs in biology or electrical engineering study sociology, psychology, and political science, right?
And I'm already thinking of the 4-box model that put those 2 things.
You got it, man. Now let me add another dimension for you just for fun. A person I admire deeply was the CEO of Pfizer. And he did something really pretty amazing. He understood what was essential in the tradition of drug discovery, which is the protocols by which you do development, and he did them way better than any regulatory process would require. They were really, really rigid in that. And then they innovated on everything else, right? They changed, they did simultaneous discovery. They built manufacturing before the drug had actually been approved. They did all sorts of, they broke every rule except the one that really mattered, what I would call traditioned innovator, right? Now, again, ask yourself, how many people are deeply rooted in tradition and are innovative at the same time?
So you have a very, very rare set of capabilities.
Exactly. And so the issue is the capacity to navigate things that feel inherently paradoxical. So high integrity politician, and what we mean by that is the ability to bring people together that are from very disparate points of view, but not lose the core idea or lose your integrity in the process. a globally minded localist. And so there's a flip in the world today. If you think about where the world is going, most of the problems can be dealt with best at a local level. So at Lincoln, right? So that's sort of why you went there. You can solve them at a local level, but there's a lot of stuff happening globally you have to be aware of, right? So the pandemic, climate, whatever the issue is that you have to be aware of. And so it's the flip of what we used to say, which is a global person with local awareness, right? It's actually the opposite, which is a locally minded person with massive global understanding, right? And then the last one is strategic executor, right? That you have to be able to execute, because there's feedback loops. You actually strategize by beginning the proposition and learning from that and then iterating, right? It was a very different way to think about strategy and execution. And again, there are very few people who fit both sides of that deal.
And you know what strikes me when I listen to those paradoxes is, we're asking a lot of our leaders now, right? They are being, if we even just think about, the combination of technical knowledge with the style of being a humanist, as he says himself, how many people have both of those skills to a really high level? These combinations, and the other one that struck me is this combination of tradition and innovation. So really knowing what we shouldn't be letting go of, what is really important, what underpins us versus what we should be radically changing. And having that awareness, that sensitivity, that courage and humility, these are challenges for leaders at the moment,
Very, very much so. I think if anything signals the death knell of traits or characteristics of effective leaders, this is probably it. And I think the other thing it's signaling to us towards is again, we probably can't do all of these things ourselves as individual leaders. So it really does become a collective process of leadership, a distributed process of leadership, where we bring people in who can help us to understand and perhaps overcome some of these paradoxes.
Absolutely, which brings us back to the diversity of thought, doesn't it? Because one person can't answer all of these challenges, all of these issues, and make all of these decisions that are coming our way. So, Craig, from me, thank you both for your time today in helping summarise these really important themes, but also in the relationship that we have with the business school and with the support over the TED Talks. I really hope that everybody has found this interesting, and I really hope that you have time to look at the TED Talk interviews. They really are a real wealth of experience and knowledge, different perspectives that can really help support your learning and hopefully your decision making in the future. Thank you very much.